Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. We'll give you a few minutes here to get to load up here. I'm here with Neal Khosla. He's coming to us from Portola Valley, I understand, right?
Actually, right now I'm in Maui, so I have the privilege of being on the Hawaiian Islands.
Well, we got you with your son, Phoenix, but no beach. So you're on your vacation, or why? What are you doing in Maui?
I'm just camping out here for a couple of weeks,
That's nice. That's nice. So this is a new segment that we have called Startup Spotlight, and we were introduced to Neal from our partners at TriNet. So we were excited to learn more about your company and you. So before we get started, this is a really awesome opportunity to touch base with Neal. So if you have questions, go to Whova, the Whova app. This is our venue. Go to Whova, go to the Q&A and type your questions in there, and I will broadcast them live to Neal. Try not to go through Zoom because then it gets confusing. Also, if you hear anything that you like here, we love social. Our hashtag is PHX Startup Week, and retweet, tweet everything that you're hearing. So first, Neal, let's hop right into it. You studied machine learning at Stanford and Google. Why?
That's a great question. So the real story is when I was 8 or 9 years old, I was a nerdy kid who loved sports and in particular baseball. And when I was 8 or 9, I read Michael Lewis's book, Moneyball. And for a nerdy kid who loved baseball and loved math, that was like the coolest thing in the world. Because what it said to me was, you can use mathematics to be better than people at other things. And that sort of became my consistent thread throughout the rest of my life. So I became very interested in what they call sabermetrics or analytics in baseball. I ended up doing an internship in high school working on analytics with the San Francisco 49ers. Did a bunch of consulting with different NBA teams on analytics throughout college. And there was a pretty natural transition from analytics to statistics to machine learning. And so it just was sort of a continuation of that trend and that sort of intellectual pathway in my life. And it's continued to be a trend into what I'm doing in adulthood. So.
Awesome. I was hoping that you could fill us in with the definition and how you sort of relate to an emotional rationalist. You're a self-proclaimed emotional rationalist. What is that?
That's a great question. That's a totally made up term. For me, one of the other schools of thoughts that I got introduced to pretty early on that I thought was really interesting at first was behavioral economics, because as somebody who is very numbers driven, I thought it was pretty fascinating to learn, like, look at all the ways in which humans actually aren't analytical and numbers driven. And for a long time, I thought, wow, this is really, really cool. About a year after I graduated from Stanford, I read a book by Jonathan Haidt, who's a professor. He's now at NYU, but I think at the time he was at UVA. Or maybe I have that backwards. But anyways, he wrote a book called The Happiness Hypothesis, and he has a whole series of books and has done a bunch of research on this topic that he calls moral psychology. And one of the things that he talks about is, he effectively has done a bunch of studies that really suggest that the way humans make decisions is motivated first and foremost by their emotions, and that in fact emotions play a key role in helping drive our decision-making processes and our desires. And it's hard to separate that from how we think. So, for example, if you think it's rational to eat healthy and work out more so that you can live longer, that's rooted in some sort of like emotional desire to live longer. There's some assumption there. And I think this is a really interesting paradox then for people who try to be rational or describe themselves as rationalists, because my realization was it's sort of a moot point to try and aspire to being a perfectly rational human being. And that in fact, you need to cultivate and have a set of emotions that lead to desires that give you a sort of core motivation. And so you're caught between this sort of catch 22 of I have all these emotions on one hand, and I'm trying to be rational. And then on the other hand, I can't be rational because all rationality is based on some root level of emotions. And so my sort of self-described thing is, despite this paradox, it's important for people to try and be rational and act as a rationalist, but take into account that it's an impossible goal. So maybe that was a little bit abstract, but the idea is that I guess if I was going to say it in a sentence, it would be that I think it's important to lean into and understand your own emotions and desires, but still try and maintain some level of rationality within that.
Yeah, EQ versus statistics. I don't know, analytics, sort of.
I think it's saying that like historically people have tried to pair those two things against each other. And I think inherently to be a healthy human being, you need both.
I agree. Yeah, that's awesome. So let's hop right into your companies. You've had two venture-backed health companies. So first, before we start, down specifics, why health?
That's a great question. I I sort of stumbled into healthcare. It was never something I wanted to do. I what ended up happening is I had a few family members touch the system, and I started reading a little bit about the system, and I just became fascinated. The U.S. healthcare system is so backwards and broken in so many ways, and whenever you talk to somebody who's new to healthcare, there's always this desire to try and assimilate all of the problems into one or two pithy sentences, but that's not really possible. And so I would just say that I just got attracted to the problems and how important it was to people's lives. And you just see the ways in which healthcare really disturbs people's, well-being, health is everything. So I don't know. This is a poor answer, but at the end of the day, it was about working on something that was important to people and that is a big problem, and where I didn't see a lot of just radically different approaches to solving it. One of the things I always say about the U.S. healthcare system is the problems are obvious, the solutions are obvious, and then they don't work. And so it's an interesting space in that regard, where you're trying to figure out how can we do things differently? How can we not just talk about how the problems are broken or how the system is broken, but really bring new solutions that can change things. And so that was really exciting to me.
Awesome. So your startup is Curai, and maybe tell us a little bit about the company and what problems you're trying to solve with it.
Sure. So we're a virtual primary care provider. So the idea is we give patients a relationship with an individual physician on their phone. Our model is primarily chat-based. So it's primarily messaging, almost like text and email with your doctor. And then the beauty of our model is that we found ways to use AI to both broaden sort of the specialization of the physicians and increase their set of knowledge, but then also to bring down the cost of care. And so the idea is that we think AI can be sort of a great equalizer and a superpower in enabling physicians to reach more patients with higher quality, broader, more holistic care. And so that's kind of the elevator pitch for what we've been working on.
How is it different from telehealth?
That's a great question. So historically, telehealth to us has been limited to one-off episodic kind of video chats with your physicians. So the idea is you have a problem now, we find some random physician that's available to take your call, and they're going to get on a call with you for 15 minutes. And there's very little technology other than we're putting you on a Zoom call. for us, the model is actually to build more continuity of care, to address more ongoing and chronic problems, as opposed to just these one-off episodic things, to allow patients to build a relationship with an individual physician, and then also to build up that scaffolding in terms of technology that allows us to increase the scope of care. So most telehealth traditionally is limited to about 30 conditions. We can handle a much broader set of things through that ongoing relationship, but also through some of the decision support that we provide to our physicians, and then also to change the economics of care. So whereas telehealth is typically taking an $150 brick and mortar visit and turning it into a $50 video call, we can do the same thing for under $10. And the goal is to get that lower and lower, eventually to $1, where you could go to all parts of the developing world and say, we can give you access to the best guidance, to medical expertise at the level of a US physician. But we're going to be able to do it at a price point where anybody, any of the 8 billion people in the world, can actually afford that. And that's really the idea behind building an AI system that can support doctors in their reach.
I've always wondered about healthcare online, whether it's telehealth or anything else, of how a doctor can supplement, the relationship in person, or using their hands or their eyes up close to diagnose something. And also, I think privacy, right? So you're in your home and you have people running around. Like, if you come to my house, it's very loud. Do you have the privacy to be really open and honest about what's going on with you? Do you find this in your customer base, and how are doctors and how are you proposing to overcome these hurdles?
Yeah, so really tricky hurdles. I mean, obviously, there's limitations to what you can do in a telehealth setting. What we found is it still represents 80 to 90% of what you would traditionally get in a primary care office. And when we can't help a patient, we're going to work with them to find options, offline, and give them some guidance through that rest of the system. I would say, in terms of privacy side, that's one of the things that we really think is an advantage of chat, is the ability to do these things on the go without having to get on a Zoom call. At this point, there's so much Zoom fatigue around getting on another call. And so we found that patients much prefer almost just having like an email thread with their physician that they can address throughout the day, in a meeting, and it could still be private and accessible to them.
Awesome. Maybe you can tell us a little bit of, like, maybe 2 or 3 things that you have that you're really excited about that have gone right, and then maybe 1 or 2 things that you didn't expect, maybe not going so right, or things you've learned about Curai.
Things I'm really excited about. I mean, I think for us, what we found is when we started the company, my perspective was AI was awesome, but very few people had found ways to make it practical. I feel like one of the reasons I started the company was to say, here's how we're going to deploy AI into real world situations to make a difference. And we've done that. Like I said, I mean, we can reduce the cost of a telemedicine visit by 4 or 5x. And that alone, I think, is pretty impressive. And so that's something that's gone right. Let's say on the side of things that have gone wrong or been surprising, I would say in that process, we've learned a lot more about humans than we have about AI and technology. And so it's certainly been a learning, it's been a long lesson to recognize that if you want to build AI technology, ultimately it comes down to how you deploy it in a human process to make a difference. I think we sort of at the beginning maybe thought a little bit more of if we build it, they will come. And certainly that was a lesson learned. And part of the reason that we ended up going with a model where we're hiring our own physicians, bringing them in-house and getting them to actively be a part of the development of the technology, the tools, and how they fit into their workflow. Because what we've found is building much better tools for our providers and integrating the AI directly into those tools in a way that's workable for them just makes the AI significantly more impactful. And so it's been we call it like a co-evolution process where we're getting feedback from providers, we're changing the technology, which is changing the workflow for providers, which is leading to more feedback. So we're constantly learning there was probably 3 or 4 really broken attempts to get different AI tools into workflows. And we've settled on a couple of models that seem to be working really well. So it was a longer road than we thought.
Did that at all influence the thought process of if we build it, they will come? And did that influence your decision to be venture backed, or why did you choose that fundraising mode?
That's a great question. I mean, I think we knew that this was going to be a long-term bet where we needed to experiment and learn and take a bigger view here. I mean, the goal is inherently to try and get healthcare to 8 billion people. And so I think the ambition was there to be venture backed. I think we didn't want to focus on making a profit early on. We wanted to say, hey, we want to get the model of delivering care right and the tools and the technologies right before we go out there and just try and scale and sell. And frankly, when I've looked at a lot of the telehealth companies out there, I've seen, and virtual care companies in general, I think they're pretty light on tools and technologies if you actually look under the hood. And I think a big part of that is a lot of these companies have to get into those sales cycles quickly, and healthcare slow. And so they're just not able to fund kind of that long view. And so we started, we've been around 4 years now. And so a lot of it was just saying, how do we take a more deliberate path that's not as focused on profitability at first, but focused on a much larger potential market and upside.
Right before we jump into questions, if you have any questions, go ahead and post them in Whova. One last one. What advice would you give to someone that is looking to raise funds in general, and then maybe also specifically in a healthcare company?
Yeah, I mean, I would say in general, the number one piece of advice I give people is to focus on their story, not to focus on, people go online and they find these things that say, like, here are the 10 slides you need in a fundraising deck. It's market, problem, solution, team, go to market strategy. I don't know, and what I find when I look at a lot of decks for other entrepreneurs who are asking for help, is they treat these things like check boxes. And so what you get is this sort of like Frankenstein thing that has all the information. What I encourage people to do is say, especially early on, but even true, this is even true if you look at Elon Musk, like he does this when he's trying to raise money or create publicity around Tesla. The currency that people deal with is in stories. And so you've got to sit down and be able to tell a story that gets a venture investor to connect with you. And so when you sit down and say to them, we are a company building an API for X, and the market is this size, and our team has 3 software engineers on it, and so on and so forth, there's no story there, right? And so if you listen to the way Patrick Collison at Stripe talks about Stripe, he says, we're enabling the GDP of the internet. I don't know if that's his exact language. Now that sounds very like highbrow and fancy. But the reality is it's a story that Patrick is telling that says, this is how this company is going to be so large. This is how this company is going to be so impactful. It's really crafting a narrative. And so the way I recommend people do fundraising is that they sit down and they write their story in plain English. I say, like, why is this an interesting and impactful company? And then you line up the facts of your company, the team and the market and all that stuff with that story. And so Elon's doing the same thing with Tesla, right? He's saying, like, hey, we are going to be the company, or SpaceX, we're going to be the company that colonizes Mars. It's an insane idea. But then what he does is he creates the facts. He creates simulations and demos and things that make these things come to life. He treats it as an active story. So I would just tell people fundraising is not an exercise in putting together the right pitch deck with the right facts. It's an exercise in storytelling. And then the only other piece of advice I give people is always be super cognizant of the reasons investors should invest in your company, which could be team, could be market, could be early traction, but also the reasons that they shouldn't. And if investors like people who understand why somebody should not invest in your business, right? And then because that tells them you're thinking about it. So Josh Wolf, who's a partner at Lux Capital, who I don't know, but I like this. He says, failure comes from failure to imagine failure. And so venture investors are looking for people who are thinking about, how is this company going to fail and what am I doing to mitigate that risk?
That's awesome advice. And you're the second one today to say it's not just a pitch deck. So I'm really happy to have the continuity and message
Good.
there.
Good.
Okay, so we have 3 questions. The first one, do you employ physicians? The answer is yes, right? You've
Yep.
mentioned that. Okay. Okay. The second one, do you foresee a competitive threat from big healthcare providers or tech companies once the possibility of telemed becomes more clear? Are insurance issues complicating what you are trying to do?
Sure. I think it's a great question. Sorry, I'm reading it along in Hoover. Where is this? I am not too worried about big healthcare. I mean, Amazon has Amazon Care, which I think is a real legitimate. Sorry, I'm not too worried about big tech. Amazon has Amazon Care, which is a legitimate effort, and I think we're certainly watching what they're doing there. Maybe that's the one exception. I think Microsoft and Google as well are more likely to be tools providers and enablers of other groups. So Google has a big investment and stake in American Well. Microsoft is starting to sell Teams to health systems to enable their healthcare. So I think there are some competitive threats. It's not what keeps us up at night in any way. I think the landscape in telehealth is incredibly competitive, but it's not what keeps us up at night. I would just say from the big healthcare providers, not really. I think in general they're pretty tethered to their brick and mortar model from a reimbursement perspective, from an economics perspective, nor do they have the sort of innovation capability to build some of the things we're building. I think at the end of the day, they're probably more of a partner than they are a competitor.
Great.
I guess the second part of that question, are insurance issues complicating what you try to do? To some degree, yes. It's complex, but yes.
I have a follow-up to that. Do you see the largest need for disruption in insurance companies or in healthcare?
Insurance companies aren't going anywhere, and neither are provider systems, as far as I can see. Even if you look at some of these heavily backed insurance efforts, Bright Health, Oscar, et cetera. I mean, United Healthcare owns like 33% or more of the US healthcare market. So I just don't see them going anywhere in the next decade. So people need to figure out how to work with some of these existing behemoths to make care work. And to be honest, I've never been more optimistic about our ability to do that in the virtual care space, because I think all of the large insurance companies are definitely starting to look and think about how they change their virtual offerings. So,
could you speak to what enabled your focus deliberately on getting the technique right, a potentially larger market versus not worrying about profitability?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say it's 2 things. One, I mean, we did have venture money, seed funding from the beginning, and so that helped, and that was certainly a privilege we had. But I don't think that's the hardest challenge in today's environment. There's so much early stage money going around. The question is, how do you get it, and then how do you get a team that wants to focus on that when there's mega rounds being announced every day and so much FOMO going on? So at the end of the day, what enabled us was our story and our people, right? It's a right set of people internally who care about what your mission is and what that end goal is and are willing to experiment and take a long view. And then it's that story, which is helpful for finding those people, but also for getting those initial funds. I mean, the reality is most seed rounds today, or pre-seed rounds, which can be up to $1 million or more in some cases now, it's insane, are being done on a story or very little traction. It's hard if you are a consumer service, like a strictly consumer service like a CPG company or a social media app. Some of those struggle a little bit more without traction, but even then, some of them are able to with a good enough story. So I would just say it goes back to the story you're telling, so that you can get some of that early capital, and then the people you align yourself with.
Awesome. Last question, COVID. How did your company do? Was that good? Did it provide complication? Tell us about it.
All the above. I think it's been good for the virtual care space as a whole. I do think some of the gains are a little bit overstated, mostly because a lot of the gains were in traditional provider networks starting to deliver care virtually. I suspect an increasing amount of that will go back to brick and mortar care because of the way reimbursement models are set up for systems to get paid more for patients who go in. I would say it's complicating because it's changed the environment in terms of working with large employers, with large payers, but also exciting. So there's more opportunity than ever before. I think more and more people are sort of interested in where this is all going. So
awesome. Well, thank you, Neal Khosla, CEO of Curai. This is our first startup spotlight. Thank you so much for your time. We hope you enjoy the beach in Maui, and we appreciate you investing in us. If you want to get in touch with him, you can go on his profile. Maybe he'd be so generous as to hop in and answer any additional questions that are here. Thank you so much, Neal. Be well.
thank you.
Have a good one. Take care. Yeah, bye-bye.